If you want to learn from failure, you need to ask what is to be done before you ask who's to blame. Because once you ask who's to blame, everybody's minding their backs. If I went to Blair with a problem, I always said, so we've got this problem. I want you to know that, but these are the options. This is how we think we will deal with it. So you're always going with a creative solution. The basic idea that when you go in to negotiate something, don't get mad, don't get even, get what you want. And think about if you humiliate somebody in that process, how that's probably going to make doing whatever it is more difficult.
Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life. How can you achieve truly ambitious and challenging things? What if you could follow a proven pattern to tackle your most challenging plans? Whatever it is you'd like to do, whether it's starting a business, running a marathon, or transforming a school, this episode is for you. My guest is Sir Michael Barber, whose career has straddled the world of elite sport and government. Since joining the government back in 1997, he's advised 7 of the last 8 prime ministers, the exception being Liz Truss. In the world of sport, Michael has advised Team Sky, the elite cycling team, and he's a member of the Football Association's Technical Advisory Board, which helps the FA prepare England's teams, both men and women, for major tournaments. Michael's written a book called Accomplishment, and we discuss some of the key themes in this episode so that you can immediately start applying them in your own life. It was an absolute pleasure talking to Michael, and I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. Sir Michael Barber, how lovely to have you on the podcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Simon.
So am I, very much so. Now, Michael, do you mind if I call you Michael?
No, please call me Michael.
Okay, it does make things a little easier. I've already introduced you in the introduction, but I'm just going to recap briefly. Obviously, you've had a very impressive career straddling the worlds of government and elite sport. You joined the UK government in 1997 to become the chief advisor on school standards. Since 97, you've advised 7 of the last 8 prime ministers, the exception being Liz Truss. In 2001, you set up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, the first of its kind anywhere on the planet, now replicated across the globe, which was responsible for delivering the government's main policies. You've advised governments on every continent. In the world of sport, you've advised Team Sky, and I know you're a very keen cyclist yourself as well. Have been a member of the FA's Technical Advisory Board since 2016, which has obviously helped the FA prepare England's teams, men and women, for major tournaments, and that's obviously gone very well since 2016. And since the back end of last year, you've been advising the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, on the government's skills reform programme. So that's quite the CV, and that's only the overview. So you're certainly a past master at getting things done, aren't you?
Well, that's become my theme, how to get things done. And oddly, it turns out when you start writing about it and the books I've written and the things I've done, there are very few people who focused specifically on how you get big, ambitious and challenging things done. There's lots of people doing big, ambitious and challenging things. But what I've tried to do, first of all, in government and then later looking at elite sport and other contexts, is there a pattern to accomplishing ambitious and challenging things? I think there is. I've written about it, and that's what my expertise, and that's what I focus on in my work. And it applies to yourself if you want to achieve a personal goal, to your organization if you want to achieve an organizational outcome, or to a government, or indeed right now to climate change across the planet. So you can, at every level, the pattern of accomplishment is relevant.
Absolutely. I've got your book in front of me, Accomplishment. As I mentioned to you before, a thoroughly enjoyable read and chock full of really valuable information. And we're going to dive into it. But a couple of things I want to just chat about before we do.
Yes.
I've heard you described, or I've read you described as the least Machiavellian person I've ever known by one former Labour minister. How would you describe yourself, Michael?
Well, that's I think that's a compliment. But how do I describe myself? I describe myself as somebody who is very driven by getting things done. So when I was working in the Blair administration, first of all on education and then on delivery of the Prime Minister's agenda, I was completely focused on it. So I describe myself as somebody who's driven and will work really hard with a kind of sense of frustration, if not with myself, if things aren't going well, and I'll work at it till I get it done. So very driven, but also very open to creative solutions as you try and do these difficult things. And finally, and I mentioned this in my book, the Quaker upbringing I had
Yes.
makes me think very hard about how I build relationships with people in the work context. So when I was working for Blair, I could have gone around saying, the Prime Minister's incandescent, what the hell are you doing? This isn't good enough. I didn't do that, but I did keep the focus. I did keep the ambition, but I worked on the relationship because you want people to be able to talk to you and feel they trust you, even if you're going to challenge them. So I think probably if I specialize in one thing, it's that last thing. It's the Quaker upbringing, the thought about others, the way you build a relationship without losing sight of being driven and getting the ambitious things done.
And you nod to your Quaker heritage right at the start of the book, don't you? I think actually that's the dedication for the book, isn't it?
Yes. There's a dedication to my Quaker upbringing and heritage, and then the first story I tell of accomplishment is of the extraordinary woman Mary Fisher, who was a servant girl in Selby and ended up going to try and convert the Ottoman Sultan to
Oh
Quakerism.
yes, yeah, absolutely. That was a cracking story. Yes, she was
Great.
a very brave woman. And I want to ask you about your Quaker heritage, but very quickly, you said you're very driven and love to get things done. What are you like at doing nothing?
I'm not very good at that, actually. I can very happily sit and read a book, but sit and do nothing or lie on a beach and do nothing. I'm not very good at that at all.
It's interesting because I was speaking to someone about this very topic just last night, and I think that's very common, isn't it? The sort of balance between doing and being, shall we say? It's very much slanted towards doing, and I'm not. There's no judgment towards that, but there is a sort of busyness in modern life
Yeah.
that means that there is a bit more room for perhaps stillness as well. I know this is going slightly off track, but I just wonder what you think about that.
I think that's right. There's a hymn, isn't there, that talks about the still small voice of calm. I do think we're at risk of losing that, and you do need time for reflection, particularly if you're doing ambitious, challenging things and trying to get them done. You do need to pause and not exactly switch off, but try and hear the still small voice of calm. And sometimes that's where creativity comes from. So I said I'm not very good at it, and that's I think true. But I do try, in spite of that, to make time to do that.
Yes. And obviously, you touched on already, some of the really big issues facing humanity, like climate change. And it just got me slightly thinking about the Blaise Pascal quote, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is all of humanity's problems are caused by man's inability to sit in a room alone without stimulation, or a variation on that. Because obviously, we're talking about getting big things done, and we'll come to that. But in some ways, if you're looking to get big things done and perhaps not necessarily coming from that right place, that can sometimes cause more problems than solutions, don't you think?
I think I think it's a very good question actually, and I think you can when you're faced with a problem or a challenge or something you want to get done, you can dash off trying to do something without thinking it through or without thinking of the risks and benefits, and just sort of dash at it and then mess it up. So I do think some reflection at the beginning, both about the planning, which we can come to, but also about the ethical underpinning of what it is you're trying to do. And one of the things I talk about, as you know, in the book, is that accomplishment isn't just about achieving ambitious and difficult things; it's doing it in the right way. And I use Emil Zatopek as my example of that. So I do think you need that moment of reflection before you just charge off doing things where you might be trampling over people, or you might not be considering how it will affect others in the way that you should have done.
And that comes back to your Quaker background, insofar as values are clearly very important. If your doing is underpinned by, sincere and genuinely held values, then obviously you've got a better chance to, I would imagine, not to create a wake of disquiet behind you. And there is that Quaker view, isn't there, that you're on the planet to make a difference. So do you consider yourself and the work you do, it's always very values driven? And how important are values and that kind of view of things, in terms of accomplishment? Because it's all very well going out to try and accomplish things, but without that, things can go awry.
Yes. So, well, I try to be values driven. I'm sure I fall short sometimes, but yes, I do try to be values driven. And when I'm working on health waiting times targets for Blair, which we hit with a 4-hour wait for A&E and all those targets, I'm not just thinking about the target. I'm thinking about what that means for people who don't have to wait for a long time in A&E and get treated more rapidly, or if you're trying to cut crime by 30%, as we were, the benefits that brings to people in communities, their ability to lead their lives. So when I think about government work, I'm always trying to emphasize this is about liberating people. It's about giving people opportunity, or communities opportunity, or families opportunity. It's about freeing people to enable them to achieve their own goals. So when you're a government, I quote in the book that that wonderful former Prime Minister of Mozambique saying that the improvement in the economy wasn't down to the government. It was down to the fact that they'd, quote, unlocked the music in people. And I think a lot of government work is about unlocking music in people. So I do always try to root my work into those values. I'm sure I sometimes fall short, but it also affects the way you treat people, the way you interact with people, which is fundamental. Because governments, it's true in elite sport too, you're under enormous pressure to get results. And that can lead to anger, to frustration, to humiliation, all the things that we sometimes see. So bearing in mind the way you build relationships is fundamental to this.
What benefit do you think people, society could get from a Quaker outlook? And how would you summarize perhaps the Quaker way of doing things that you think might benefit people and the way people go about things?
I attribute it to my Quaker upbringing, but I'm not now an active Quaker, and certainly don't speak for them, although I have a lot of respect for Quakerism. I think the fundamental value in Quakerism, attributed to the founder of it, a guy called George Fox in the middle of the 17th century, is that, quote, there's that of God in everyone. And you don't have to believe in God to take that seriously. So you can think of that you're always looking for the positives about people. It doesn't mean you ignore the negatives, but you have to remember that each person is equal in their rights and responsibilities on the planet. And he was saying all that at a time of great deference, where poor people were meant to doff their caps to their masters, and he refused to do that. He refused to swear on the Bible in court because he would always tell the truth. So why should he swear on the Bible at that point? So there's a thing about equity, each individual being of equal worth, and there's a thing about looking for the positives, or the in the sort of Quaker language of the time, the divine inner light in each individual. And I think you can take that philosophy and apply it into your daily life now, regardless of whether you're a Quaker or not.
Yeah, no, I like that. A way I would put it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of seeing through the illusions of mental hierarchies. That if we look back to 17th, 18th century, perhaps more in terms of royalty and lords and that kind of thing, whereas now it's perhaps celebrity and sporting icons and that kind of thing. So it's shifted a bit, but we still have that propensity to put people on pedestals and defer to them until we want to knock them off the pedestal because they don't live up to the impossible ideal we put on them. But is that fair to say, seeing through that sort of mental hierarchy propensity?
Yes, exactly. So treating people with equal respect. And I often say, effectively, when I look back on my career, I've been an educator. I started off actually as a teacher, but I also taught children with special educational needs. And then later on, when I was working for Blair and the prime ministers after that, in effect, I was an educator of prime ministers. And the latter are more challenging than the children with special educational needs, incidentally. But the point about being an educator is you treat people as equal worth. A prime minister is worthy of respect. That's a very, very tough job to take on. But the individual who is prime minister is no more or less worthy of respect than anybody you run into. They're all equal in terms of the respect you should offer them as an individual human being trying to get through life, get through the day in often challenging times.
I think that's a really wonderful point to make. So thank you for that, Michael. And just in terms of accomplishment and doing big things, which alludes to this a little bit, is fair to say, what is big for one person might be small for someone else, and what is small for one person might be big for the next. So if I think of someone like, say, Richard Branson, who's obviously got huge ambitions, yourself as well, versus someone, for example, who has not been blessed with good genes, good upbringing, good temperament, all of those things, none of which, of course, we choose. Perhaps they're struggling with mental or physical health. So, the blueprint that you're coming up with in terms of doing big things that are really going to stretch people beyond what they initially perhaps think are possible, it does vary from person to person.
It varies absolutely, Simon, and it varies from organisation to organisation, or government to government, or sports team to sports team. If you're in League Two and you really seek to get promoted, or have a good season and maybe a bit of a cup run, that's perfectly a reasonable set of ambitions and accomplishments. But if you're Liverpool or Manchester City, probably aspiring to something more than that. So I do think that this varies enormously. Here's how I define, from the point of view of the individual or the organisation, a real accomplishment is where you take on something ambitious and challenging. So it's ambitious for you or for that organisation, and it's challenging. And by the second bit, the challenging, I mean you don't know everything you need to know at the beginning to achieve it.
Right.
If you knew everything you needed to know to achieve it, it's not that difficult. But if it's challenging, you've got to set the goal and then learn as you go. And a lot of my book is about how you design into a process of pursuing a goal the learning process that enables you to learn and get better as you do it. So whether you're, as I describe in the book, myself trying to do a 10-mile time trial in under 25 minutes, how do you actually do that? Or if I'm working for Justin Trudeau government and he wants to provide clean drinking water to every Indigenous Canadian community, he has to learn as he goes. So that when you set ambitious goals, you have to learn as you go. Otherwise, it's not really ambitious.
Absolutely. And so you talk about sharing a blueprint from international sport and international government for how leaders can deliver change. And the traits are the same. So, a lot of the examples you give are huge, whether it be taking on the Tour de France or even your own cycling around the country, governments. But as you say, this can be brought right down to the individual level, to people's own lives, to setting up a business, just to, having a good day almost, or running a family. It can be really come down to that level before we dive in.
It could do, yes. You don't need to read my book if you don't want to do ambitious and challenging things, or things where you need to learn as you go. But if any goal that you set as an individual, this methodology, I'm arguing, will apply. And if you pursue it with discipline, it will work. So it doesn't make it easy to do things, because by definition they're ambitious and challenging, but it makes it possible to do them if you have the discipline to pursue it.
Let's dive in. And early on, you talk about ambition. So the big goal, which, as you've said, is about something that you don't feel is achievable at the outset. You have to learn as you go. So how would you encourage someone to find out what the appropriate scale for their ambition is, so it's not too small, but also not too big?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the stories I tell in that first section of the book is the story of the people who led the British Olympic Team GB between 2012 and 2016, and they consciously, Simon Timpson and Chelsea Ward, they consciously set a goal that Britain would become the first, or would aim to become the first country to achieve more medals 4 years after they'd hosted an Olympics than the year they hosted it. So London 2012, they got 60-something medals, and they wanted to do more than that in Rio, and they set that goal. So what have they done to do that? Well, they've said, well, we know what we can achieve. We know what we did achieve in London. And then they say to themselves, actually, there are a few people who didn't quite get medals, but with a bit more of a push, a bit more preparation, a bit more the right inspiration on the day, they might have done it. So if we could have got a few more in London, why couldn't we get a few more in Rio? So they've done some benchmarking against history, basically. So that's one way into it. If you're setting a health waiting times goal, there are roughly, certainly when I was in the Blair administration, there were roughly 200 hospitals in England in England that had A&E departments. So you can look at that set of 200, and you will find probably that some of them, maybe a small number, maybe it's only one, are getting close to or actually achieving a maximum 4-hour wait anyway. So then you think, well, could I learn how to do that? What if half the hospitals did as well as that? What if all of them did as well as that? What if all of them did as well as the top half? Do you see what I mean? You can use benchmarking, and that gets you into goals that have an evidence base, but then you inject your sense of ambition. We're going to do something nobody's ever done before here. Or if you're Zatopek, you're trying to, you've reinvented the training for long distance running because you're going to try and be the best ever, and you know what times people have achieved in the past, and you're going to beat them. So benchmarking is a really good way into it. And as Dave Brailsford, who I quote in the book, says, the data informs, but it doesn't decide. So you look at what the data tells you, and then you say, well, how ambitious do we want to be? Do we want to match the best hospital in the 200 set? Do we want to match the top 10%? Do we want to be as good as the top 50%? They will give you different outcomes, but you know all of them are achievable because somebody's done it already. Or you can be Kennedy in 1961 and say, we're going to put a man, it was a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. Nobody's ever done that before. You don't know how to do it, but you're going to invest in the process of learning until you can do it. So there's lots of ways into the goal. You can just pluck a number out the air, or you can use benchmarking, and you can always look at other countries. If you're in any given country, look at what other countries have done and say, could we be as good as they are?
And you talk about the pros and cons of doing something like Kennedy did, where you're promising these huge things that make people think that's never going to happen, and then America did pull it off, through to the old adage of under promise and over deliver. And so, yeah, could you just talk a little bit about those two, and which side of the fence do you sit on?
I definitely sit on the ambition side of that, because we can talk about that, about the state of the world generally. And so under promise and over deliver is not so much about the goals you set as to how much you talk up your goals before you start. But the big problem with in some governments is you promise something huge because you want to get a headline on the day, but you haven't really thought through how you'd get it done. I quote in the book the day that Oprah Winfrey and the guy who runs Facebook and the
Zuckerberg,
Zuckerberg and the senator for New Jersey announce a big, massive investment in New Jersey schools. But then they've built the expectations so high, and they haven't even taught a single child better yet. And then they appoint somebody to do it called Cami Anderson, and she's a perfectly hardworking, thoughtful, genuine person. But the expectations are so high, it was almost bound to fail. So it's the problem there is not the ambition; it's the way they've announced it. And I think you might have seen. I tell the story in the book. You can, when you're going to announce what you're going to do, whether it's your personal goal, am I going to tell my wife that I'm going to try and do a time trial in under 25 minutes? Will she be interested? Will she think it's madness? Those kinds of things. But or if you're a government, and I get the way I describe it is you've got two options. You can do Great Expectations and Dickens, where on page 1 you're introduced to Pip and Magwitch, who are the two key characters for the remaining 400 pages. Yeah. So he's announced it right on page 1. Or you can do Moby Dick, which is where Melville doesn't introduce the main character, Captain Ahab, till page 217.
Yeah.
So by then you're captivated by the story, and suddenly the shocking Captain Ahab appears before you. And it's the same with a big change. You can just get on with it quietly and then say, look, I'm doing this, or we're doing that. Or you can announce it at the beginning, and that does raise expectations. And if you're serious about it, it's sometimes a good idea to. So that there's not a right or wrong; they're just different options. But the worst thing is to do a big announcement and then not really have a plan and not really get on with it and just sort of leave it behind you. And there are lots of governments that do that. It's called initiative-itis.
Right. And just to bring this back down to a smaller level, if someone was setting up a business, for example, and this might be a bit vague, but if someone's setting up a business where they don't need to announce a goal at all, because ultimately the only person who's really paying attention in the first instance is themselves, how about in those instances when you've only really got yourself to answer to? What about setting a big enough goal then? I mean, what advice would you have for someone starting out?
Yes, no. Well, when you set up a business, you have to be, and all the stuff about small business, setting up startups will tell you this. You start off with some idea of what you think your business will do, and then you have to learn rapidly as you go. And then the words that get used are words you have to pivot, you have to change, because you suddenly discover that what you thought people wanted wasn't quite what you were offering, and what you discover people really want is different from your idea, and you have to pivot and change. So you need, in the initial phases, that's a kind of learning experience almost into the unknown, because you're creating a business that's never existed before, and you're trying to find out as you go what works. The thing I would say to anybody who sets up a business is, yes, of course, you want the business to succeed financially, so you want it to be profitable ultimately. But what's the other purpose of it? What's its moral purpose? What change is it trying to bring in the world? I describe in the book James Dyson developing his first vacuum cleaner in a shed at the back of his garden. He had 5,127 prototypes before he arrived at one that he thought he could market. So that sense of how do I want to make people's lives better? In his case, it was a better vacuum cleaner that cleaned better and was easier to manage, etc., etc. So when you set up a business, yes, be flexible, learn as you go, learn really rapidly as you go, get feedback, pivot if you need to, but remember why you set it up and what it was for.
Michael, thank you for that. I think that was a fantastic piece of advice. That was really great. Before we move on to the next one, I was listening to an interview you did with alongside Tony Blair, and a thought experiment came up where I think it was where Tony Blair was trying to speak about what it would take to eliminate organised crime with the National Crime Agency, and he went in with a thought experiment. In fact, do you want to, as long as this rings the bells, do you want to take it over from this point? Because I thought this was really interesting in terms of how they responded and couldn't quite get their heads around it, but how valuable this thought experiment is.
Yes. So Tony Blair was very good at this in policy development terms, but and it's certainly something I use all the time when I'm working with governments, which is you're going to do something on organised crime, you set up a new agency as the Blair government had. And then you're saying to the people you've appointed to lead it, what you're going to do, and they start talking about how difficult it is and the resources and all of this. And Blair kept saying to them, but what would it take to eliminate organised crime altogether? And they'd say, well, that would be politically very difficult. He said, leave me to calculate the politics. I just want to know, if my ambition was to eliminate it, what would I have to do? How would it work? And then get them to talk about that. And then you can come to the money and the politics later. And of course, some of it will not be manageable. But that question, what would it take to, we use a lot in my company, Delivery Associates, when we're saying to them. So we're working right now for the government of Jamaica on trying to eliminate gang violence. What would it take to do that? You look at the schools, you look at where people who've been convicted of gang violence were at school, and you try to change the schools where they came from, for example. So what would it take to is a very, very good question to ask somebody. And I always say on money, because in government it always comes back to a budget. And I always say to people, don't come to the money last. Decide what it is you're trying to achieve, what it would take to achieve it, and then make the money the end of the argument, not the beginning of the argument. Whereas what you hear a lot in the public sector is, oh, that's a good idea, but we haven't got the money. You see, and 90% of creativity is killed at that moment.
So the thought experiment is removing the impediments to what it would take to do something. Coming from that space where there are no impediments, okay, what would it take? And then building the impediments back in, but you've had a vision at least of how it could be done.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's better summarized than I did, Simon.
Right, let's move on then to prioritizing. You've already mentioned Simon Simpson and Chelsea War, obviously in 2016, and the sort of myopic focus. Actually, just quickly on that, obviously the other way of looking at it, I suppose, is what came after 2016, because I was covering the Olympics in 2016 and in 2012. And 2016 was a remarkable success. And then obviously particularly the last year or two, some of the downsides to that really focused attention have come to the fore, whether it be, some of the cultures of bullying in some sports. So there are potential downsides, although I like that you said even with that, there are ways of learning from even that, the aftermath, the negative aftermath.
Yes, I think it's a very important question for all sport, actually, particularly at the very elite level, because as you know very well, and I'm sure lots of our listeners will know, competing at the very top level is extremely demanding. It requires that focus and that driven and the training. And what Dave Brailsford says, always talks about, are you prepared for the suffering as well as the success? So it's very demanding. And in the book, there's a conversation with Simon Timpson in particular about whether the stories that came out in one or two sports of bullying or excessive pressure on people leading to them to becoming demoralized or even giving up, whether that was a necessary downside of their myopic focus. He says it wasn't. He says they learned as they went. He says some teams showed that you could combine thoughtfulness about the athletes as well as that sense of very, very high ambition for gold medals. And he's now, Simon Timpson's now at Man City, bringing that philosophy to bear. Chelsea War, who was involved in all of that and did a wonderful job. She's Australian. She's gone back to run the Queensland Institute of Sport because they've got major games coming up in Australia. So the view in the early 20s of this century is you can combine thoughtfulness about the athletes with absolutely high performance and attention to their mental health. And you hear athletes more and more talking about that themselves. So I think we found a way through. It's a classic of learning collectively as we've gone through those experiences and learning from the things where it didn't go quite as well as it should. Simon talks specifically about making sure that people are getting regular feedback. So when it comes to the crucial selection moments, you're in the team or you're not, they're not taken totally by surprise because they've been getting feedback as they've gone.
Yeah. Something in the book that has really stuck with me, and actually I found myself bring it to the front of my mind a lot more since I read it, was that constant focus on the thing that you care most about. And again, just to go back to your time in the Blair government, I've heard you tell a story of after 9/11, I think it was, and you looked in the window and there were, say, 12 people around Blair sort of saying, you should do this, you should do that. And there was an impulse to go in there and offer your view as well. And then suddenly you caught yourself and said, actually, no, that wouldn't be the best use of my skills at this point. What I will do is I will make sure that I'm keeping everything ticking over, because you're obviously in charge of the delivery unit. I'll make sure that I keep on delivering. So that constant focusing on the key thing, rather than being pulled from pillar to post by email, whatever it may be. I mean, there are so many distractions, aren't there, these days? But that constant focus is fundamental.
I completely agree, obviously, because you're quoting me, but it's absolutely vital to do these ambitious and challenging things. If you get distracted by whatever comes along, and 9/11 is about as big as it gets, but you've seen much more recently governments all over the world distracted by the pandemic. But the things that you set out to do are still important as you go through that, and you've got to come back to them after you've gone through whatever it is. And what Blair said to me at the end of my 4 years in number 10 back in 2005 when I was leaving, he said that the best thing about having a delivery unit was I knew that whatever I as Prime Minister had to do to deal with the latest crises, global, EU, national, whatever it was, I knew that you, Michael, and your team were constantly focused on the big goals that the British people cared most about. So he could wake up in the night and think, oh yeah, it's okay, there's a delivery unit focused consistently on the task. And 9/11 was a big learning moment for me because we'd only just set the delivery unit up. And I could have gone in and said, look, how can I help with this? And maybe I could have helped, I don't know. But I intentionally didn't. And I said to Blair afterwards, I'm going to focus on the things we set for these 4 years unless you tell me not to. I'm going to be completely undistractable. And it was a seminal moment. And any government, you don't necessarily need a delivery unit, but you do need part of your operation that is constantly focused on your underlying goals. And that can apply in an individual level. So how did I focus when I was kind of cycle the length of the country down the West Coast, and I had a coach? Although I've got lots going on in my work, every Sunday afternoon I'm talking to my coach about what I'm going to do next week on my bike to get fit enough to do that trip. So he was my delivery unit, but I don't need to call him that. He was my coach, but he was doing the same function. Although I've got lots going on in my work, every Sunday afternoon I'm talking to my coach about what I'm going to do next week on my bike to get fit enough to do that trip. So he was my delivery unit, but I don't need to call him that. He was my coach, but he was doing the same function.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think that focusing on the key thing, I found that to be so useful and a really nice little reminder for me, as I sort of balance all the various or keep all the various plates spinning that I have.
Yes.
So I think that's such a valuable thing. And just one more thing on focus. How would you encourage people or suggest people develop focus in this age of mass distraction?
Yeah. It's a good question. I was going to mention, which I also mentioned in the book, is the Pakistan obviously had big floods last year in 2022, but it also had a flood almost as bad 10 or 11 years earlier when I was there. And I happened to arrive just after the flood had begun to recede to help to encourage education reform. And all these bleary-eyed education reformers who've been moved on to flood relief work, quite rightly, came along and said, we can't do education reform anymore. We've had a flood. And at that point, my heart went out to them. They were obviously devastated. It was a terrible experience, but I was quite unsympathetic in one way. I said, did the flood make your schools better? And obviously the answer to that was no. So if it didn't, you had an education crisis before the flood, you've still got one after the flood. So at some point, you've got to get back to it. And that sense of this really matters is the answer to your question. So if you've set an ambitious and challenging goal because it matters to you personally or to your organization or your government or your sports team, then when something distracts you, you may have to deal with it, but you've still got to get back to the goal because it was important before and it's now even more important. And so you need a reference point about what matters most to you or to your organization.
Fantastic. And obviously that applies to whether you're in business, to a family, to a sport, whatever it may be. Before we get on to planning, because that's obviously an important one, just a very quick word, Michael, on embracing failure as the very thing that helps us succeed. So obviously, failure can feel catastrophic when the money's running low, for example, but actually embracing failure is key to big things.
Yes, it is, and so when things go wrong, or when you tried something and didn't get it, you fell short. How you learn from that is fundamentally important. It's quite hard in government because every failure is all over the media, and so it's quite painful to go through a failure. But you do have to systematically learn from it. What did work, what didn't work, and how do we do that differently? So I experienced that in the education policy in the Blair years. So we were trying to reduce the number of failing schools, and were ultimately successful. We tried to set up area-based initiatives like education action zones early on, and then that really didn't work. I announced it at a conference in Bradford. The announcement went horribly wrong. There was lots of bad media. Ministers were cross with David Blunkett and with me. But we learnt from that, and then we established a thing called Excellence in Cities, which was better than that, but not perfect, but definitely made a difference. And then we got a thing called the London Challenge, which became renowned for really transforming the quality of London schools. So London is seen globally and in this country as a really big education success story. But my point is, I'm confident that we couldn't have done the London Challenge without the experience of the failure of education action zones and then the learning from Excellence in Cities. So you have to learn from those programs, and it's not about long, slow academic evaluations after the event. It's about systematically learning as you go through it and then as you experience the failure, and not getting into blame. I think I don't know if you remember this bit, but there's a bit in the book where I talk about my experience 15 years or so ago in Russia, where I started learning a bit of Russian to try and help improve the education system back then. And they said to me, well, Michael, there's only two phrases you have to learn in Russian. One is who's to blame, and the other is what's to be done.
Yes.
And if you want to learn from failure, you need to ask what is to be done before you ask who's to blame. Because once you ask who's to blame, everybody's minding their backs, keeping out they're not talking about it. Whereas if you can get the right culture of learning from failure, so much the better.
Yes, that definitely stuck with me. Yeah. So what is to be done, not is who is to be blamed, or that
Yeah.
first and the other second, perhaps. Okay, moving on to planning. And there's obviously a lot here, and I'm just conscious we've still got quite a lot to get through. So there's the famous Mike Tyson quote that I'm fairly sure he didn't say first, which is that everyone has a plan until they're punched in the face. So, there are various stories. Probably the best one to go to would be the Gareth Southgate with penalties pre 2018. But maybe touch on, if you could just tell that story. But as well, what are the key elements to building a plan? And then also the danger of planning stopping you from taking action.
Yes, absolutely. So the danger of planning. Let's start there. So you can spend a long time writing plans. My favorite or my classic example from history is McClellan, who was Abraham Lincoln's first general in the American Civil
Yeah.
War, and he's constantly planning, constantly training. But because he loves the way his army looks, he's very, very cautious about ever deploying it. And Lincoln's saying, this is no good." And then he eventually appoints Ulysses Grant to run it, who had various character flaws but was a good general. And when people in the administration said, "You've got to fire Grant," he said, "I can't fire that man. He fights." So you need to get beyond planning. We when I'm working with governments around the world, I always say, yes, you need a plan, but don't spend so long planning. Get on with it. Get started. Start testing this out. So while you're doing the planning, there's no reason for not getting started. The second thing is to remember the famous Eisenhower thing. It's not so much the plan, which has the Mike Tyson effect. Once you start, it never works properly. It's the planning. It's the process of planning, of thinking it through, identifying the risks, how you're going to manage them, all of that. So the process of planning is really important. But the actual plan, the written plan, is not the key thing. It's the process that you've gone through and your if you've done it well, your deeper understanding of what the challenge is and how you're going to achieve it. So Dave Brailsford on the Tour de France, when they get the route for the next year, they ask the question, what are the demands of the event? They assess the demands of the event in detail. That hill climb in that particular place at that stage in the tour, that time trial on that slope, wherever it is, what will it take? Who will be able to do it? So the planning is crucial. It's not the plan that matters; it's the planning.
And just quickly, the Gareth Southgate penalty story, because what I particularly enjoyed about this was the detail, because to me it always seemed daft, and in hindsight, I'm sure it does to pretty much everyone, that England football managers allegedly did not practice penalties because they just believed that it was one of those things that you can't practice, which is patently absurd. But when it came to Gareth Southgate pre 2018, the World Cup, where they finally did win a penalty shootout, it wasn't just the practice, although that was key for the goalkeepers as well. But what I quite enjoyed, which I didn't realise, was even attending to those moments between the end of the game and the start of the penalty shootout, where it could typically be bedlam, and it was actually even setting a process in stage for that. So, yeah, would you mind just touching on this briefly?
Yeah, as you say, Simon, he decided that in a tournament, you're quite like if you're going to win a tournament, it's quite likely that at some point on the process on that route journey, you will have to go through a penalty shootout, and it's a practicable skill taking a penalty, and so he had all the squad taking penalties and deciding what penalty they're going to take. Crucial when they step up, not changing their mind between walking from the centre circle to the penalty spot and just doing the penalty they practiced hundreds of times. So that was good. The goalkeepers preparing for each of the people who might be taking a penalty against them and deciding as a group, regardless of who's actually going to be on the field for the penalty shooter, which way they dive if X or Y steps up to take a penalty, because they've looked at lots of televised penalties by all the opposition before. That's really good. But you're right. If anybody's watched a penalty shootout knows that between the final whistle and the first penalty, there's quite a long time. The television companies have gone to an advert break. There's a lot to be decided. There's loads of people. Everybody's in a state of hypertension, and Gareth Southgate wanted to bring calm, or as much calm as possible, to that. So everybody's role was clear. The kit person knows what he or she should or shouldn't do. He tells which he's decided who's going to take the penalties, and so he brings a kind of greater degree of calm to that phase, so that when they take the penalties, they can focus more easily on that, and there's no distractions. It's the same as we were talking about earlier in the conversation, actually. And then they did win that penalty shootout against Colombia, and they won another one in the European Nations League against Switzerland, and then sadly against Italy. And they didn't quite make it in the Euros final. But they have got better at penalties. They really have got much better at it. There's still the pressure of the moment on every single player. We saw that with Harry Kane against France as well. Nobody in the world would you bank on better than Harry Kane to get that penalty, but he didn't quite.
No, he didn't. No, the image is running through my head. He looked like he was trying a bit too hard on that second one.
It was such a pity because I'm sure he feels it more than anybody, because the current England team or the team that played in the recent World Cup in Qatar, when you get Bellingham, Foden, Saka, and Rashford running at you, any defence in the world is going to be terrified of those four very fast, very skillful young players. And I think they're a big threat to anybody in world football.
Absolutely. I think that, for me personally, the stick that Gareth Southgate got between or just prior to the World Cup, I think was definitely overblown. I think what he's achieved speaks for itself, and the way he's done it as well, I think is magnificent. So just moving on to managing relationships. Again, there's a lot to talk about. So I'll just going to quickly share a couple of your tips, as they were. One is not overclaiming, but giving credit, which I think was really nice. Speaking plainly, but with clarity, listening with care. But the two I'd like you to talk about briefly, if that's all right, would be, first of all, negotiation. And you talk about being hard but humble so that you can deliver bad news but leave on good terms. And then the other bit was as well, I've heard you talk about Tessa Jowell, who obviously sadly passed away, who was brilliant at managing relationships. So what was it that made her so good that anyone could learn from?
Well, let's start with Tessa Jowell, who, as you know, Simon, was the key figure in the Blair administration that helped us win in Singapore in 2005. The decision that the 2012 Olympics would be in London, and that wasn't by any means a straightforward task. Early in her role at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, she had to cancel a World Athletics thing that was going to be in London, but we weren't ready, and she just said we will mess this up. So that was quite a brave thing. So she'd learnt from failure that she'd inherited when she got the job, but then she had to first of all persuade Blair that this was a good idea to bid for the Olympics, and secondly Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor and thoughtful about the money, and then the cabinet, many of whom represented seats well out of London and might think, what's London? Why is this more going to London? But she assembled that because she's thoughtful, she's empathetic, she's focused, and she's very good at what you just said that I describe in the book, of being able to deal with a difficult conversation but leave the meeting with everybody who's been in it feeling better about themselves and where they're going than they were before. So she's a very good exemplar, or was, and we tragically lost her. She's a very good exemplar of what we need in government and politics. But the basic idea that when you go in to negotiate something, as the Harvard principal bargaining people put it, don't get mad, don't get even, get what you want. Think about what the outcome is, and think about how, if you humiliate somebody in that process, how that's probably going to make doing whatever it is more difficult. So can you get the tough message across, like this isn't working, but do it in such a way that you can that bring them with you, and indeed, if it then works, you can give them the credit. So I'll give you. I don't think I tell this in the book, but we had this whole thing in 2002 of dealing with railway performance, trying to get more trains being punctual, and you look at the data month by month, and you see that there's a big drop in performance of punctuality in October. So this is where learned naivety comes in. So you go to the Department of Transport and say, look, we've just noticed that the data is much worse in October. Why is that? They say, surely you know. And we say, no, we don't know. They say the leaves fall off the trees in autumn. We say, oh, yes, we did know that. But what we want to know is why, after 174 years of passenger trains, that takes you by surprise. They've been falling off the trees ever since there were railways. Where's your plan for autumn? And then they say, well, what would a plan for autumn be? And we say, well, the health service has a plan for winter. And then they say, well, what would a plan for autumn look like? And we say, well, is there any other country in the world where they have leaves that fall off the trees in the autumn, but the trains run on time in the autumn? And they say, oh, yeah, there's Canada. We say, how do they do that? And they say they cut down all the trees near the train tracks. And we say, oh, you can't do that. You might be able to do it in a big country like Canada with relatively small population. You can't do it here. And then they come, we say, go see if there's any other country that doesn't cut all the trees down, but still gets the trains run on time. And the answer turns out to be Poland. And we learn from the Polish and we apply that process. And from 2003 to 2013, autumn performance improved every single year for 10 years. That's a process of negotiation where you're pushing, you're not giving up. You are going to solve the problem of leaves on the line, but you're not going to just take the first excuse, because it's very easy. Somebody says, well, the leaves fall off trees. And you go, oh, yeah, that's true, actually. Well, we better forgive them for October. But we say, no, we know the leaves fall off the trees, but what we want to know is what you're going to do about it.
Yeah, that's a lovely example. And a quote I liked in the book as well is, if you're going to negotiate with someone tomorrow, don't insult him today, from Clem Attlee. And I think the example you give is Jacques Chirac, isn't it? Before in 2012. Because I remember I was in Paris, funnily enough, I think it was actually I was there for the French Open in 2005, and they were the favourites. We forget that they were the favourites ahead of London. But obviously, Mr. Chirac, I think, put his foot in it a little bit, didn't he?
He did. Well, in the run-up to the 2005 decision in Singapore, he saw it as a way of trying to get one over the British. He said, well, the British have the second worst food in Europe. And the journalist asked the obvious question, well, who has the worst food in Europe? To which the answer was Finland, who had 2 votes. And so you think that wasn't a very good negotiating tactic.
No, that made me laugh.
Yes.
Okay, moving on. Now, you talk a lot about data and monitoring, and Tony Blair said the best thing you did was build routines. But I want to move on, if we can, to discipline, persistence, and focus, and just the importance of sticking at something, particularly with what you call the implementation dip. So, yeah, can you just talk about the importance of this? I mean, it does actually come back to what we spoke about before in terms of the delivery unit. But obviously, when the going gets tough, as they say, it can be a little tricky for some people.
Yes. I mean, first of all, when you start on something ambitious, there will be generally a sense of excitement when you get started. So that motivates people. And then they realize how difficult it is. And you get that so-called implementation dip where everybody thinks, oh, my God, what have we taken on now? And it's a leadership task to carry people through that. But the persistence is important, because if it's going to take you several years to do this thing, you've got to avoid, there's a basic human thing to want to move on to something new and exciting and shiny. But actually, you need people who will just grind out results in these things. If you think of Emil Zatopek or all the athletes right now training for the Olympics in Paris, they're getting up on cold, wet mornings and rowing 10,000 yards, or they're running round and round a track, or they're doing whatever it is. So in any high achievement, there's a large part of it is just boring, grinding out the stuff that it takes to get that done. Teaching literacy hours in a primary school until you can do it, and then it's fascinating, but learning how to do it, or any of these things, there's a long grind, or nearly always a long grind before you get there. I described Dennis Bergkamp practicing passing against a wall for hours and hours and hours, and that's what made him sublime. So you've got somebody like that with amazing talent, but actually the talent's only a small part of the fact that he can do that, because he's practiced so long. And as he says in the bit I quote in the book, I found it fascinating. He's watching the bounce of the ball off the wall and learning all the time at a very deep level. So in any big accomplishment, there's almost certain to be a part of it that is grinding out results.
Yeah. It reminded me of a lovely quote from Goldie Sayers, the javelin thrower, who said success at the top level is about finding beauty in monotony, which I think speaks to what you're talking about there.
It's perfect. I'd known in the book, if I'd known it, it's perfect.
And just in terms of what you call the implementation dip, so dealing with the lows, dealing with criticism, any advice for, when things aren't going your way?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, you can identify in advance most of the criticism that's going to come and be ready for it. Why do we need to do this? Everything we're doing is already working. It's all too difficult. people won't like it. We haven't got enough money. We've got all these other things to do. So everybody's going to tell you those things anyway. So you might as well prepare your arguments for each of those cases, and I list those and things like that in the book. But the other thing is to be able to identify what's working before you get the result. So what are the things that contribute to achieving the ultimate goal? So if I know, I remember this actually right back, having mentioned the literacy hour, I might as well mention it again, but in the late 90s when we were encouraging primary schools to teach a single 1 hour literacy lesson at the literacy hour every day, which had certain features, and everybody was trained how to do that. And the idea was that would then lead to an improvement in the performance of children in reading and writing, because for 50 years before that, reading standards hadn't improved. And the results did eventually come through. But I needed to know right away whether this was working or not, because I can't wait for the test scores in 2 or 3 years' time. And so what did I check? I checked, well, first of all, the teachers are enjoying the training. How do I know that? Because they get surveyed at the end of each training session and I see the results. Secondly, the teachers are actually trying to apply the training in their classroom, which is a big breakthrough. I know that because Ofsted inspectors are inspecting several hundred schools, primary schools a month, and they can give me some data. And do parents like it? I know that because backbench MPs are telling David Blunkett that this is really going down well. So I've got 3 early indicators that will lead to the ultimate result. Or if I take another example, I work with some big American universities on the achievement gaps and the dropout rates. And they worked out that if a new student registered for the library and did training in how to use the library in their first month, they were much less likely to drop out. So that is something I can check early on, and it will be a first indicator that we're getting something on track here. So you need lead indicators, basically.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit actually of when people join gyms in January, which I think keeps gyms pretty much afloat. They've got, a third dropout within a month, whatever. And so being ready for that implementation dip that invariably comes, a few weeks afterwards, and having a plan in place to deal with it ahead of time.
Yes, so that's exactly right. And I should call that the equipment track. You join the gym, you get all the latest fashionable gym gear, the beautiful new trainers, and whatever you want to wear in the gym to show off, and you feel absolutely terrific. And then on the first sort of wet Thursday in January, you think, "Oh, sod it, I'm not going today," and then it slowly slips away. So you can prepare for that. So if everybody has that tendency, which is not unique to any individual. You can set up to talk to somebody who you know will challenge you in the 3rd week of January and say, well, have you actually been to the gym today, Michael, or not?
Yeah.
That's what my coach did when I was cycling. There were lots of times when I didn't want to go out on a Sunday in the cold and the wet with my gloves on, and fearful of getting a puncture and not being able to change the tyre with numb fingers, all the rest of it. But I did it because on Sunday I've got to talk to him and I know I'll have to tell him the truth.
Yeah, that's great. So an accountability partner is very valuable.
Find one, yeah, absolutely.
Now let's move on to one of the final things in your book, which is just the success isn't all it's cracked up to be. You talk about Bradley Wiggins, when he was really low after his cycling career. That quote from Boris Becker about expectation, having won Wimbledon in 1985, age 17, and then repeating the trick a year later, and the expectation if he lost a final, it was devastating. But as well, the quote I liked is triumph is fleeting. And so we tend to think, don't we, that when we achieve X, a big goal, a big achievement, the satisfaction and fulfillment will come. But it doesn't work like that. It might come briefly, but it will pass just like everything else passes. And therefore you can't do it for acclaim, for pats on the back, for fame, because ultimately you're setting yourself up for disappointment.
Yes. So, and I think lots of people, I interviewed once in a session for an audience, Dame Kelly Holmes and Lord David Putnam. Kelly Holmes about her fantastic achievement in the Athens Olympics, and David Putnam about winning an Oscar, and Chris Akabusi was there about that very famous gold medal in the
91. Oh yeah.
Yeah. But all of them talked about, obviously there's a massive elation at the moment of achievement. You can see Kelly Holmes' smile to
Yeah.
make any week just to watch her run down the straight for that last bit. But then there's the rest of your life to lead, and the things that challenge all of us in life are still there, and you've got to. So you've been totally focused on this, and indeed the focus you've had to achieve this thing may have actually created some frayed relationships or edges around your life that you need to get back on. So you've still got to, or if you bought a new bike, you might have to worry about the overdraft, whatever it is. You've done your achievement, but real life kicks in. And the other thing is to have done whatever the achievement is for the right reasons, because even if you don't get the credit, at least you know then that the achievement has had the benefits that you hoped from it. If you've played a key part in improving a school or reducing crime or whatever, you may never personally get the credit, but you may have worked absolutely flat out. But you can take satisfaction from the change you made in the world.
Absolutely, yeah. So it comes back to what you said at the start. It's the values underpinning it,
Yes.
rather than postponing happiness for the future, because it doesn't really work like that.
Yes.
Okay, so we've had to sort of skip over a fair bit of it, Michael, but I picked out some of the bits that really stuck with me. And for me personally, I think, as I've already said, the thing that I have taken away most readily is that focusing on the key thing and relentlessly coming back to that and reminding yourself of that. In your view, what is the most important element in terms of what you've tried to convey in accomplishment?
Well, the last bit of the book talks about the challenges facing the world, and one of the reasons I'm hopeful that, having described the pattern of how you bring about accomplishment, the disciplines involved, is that they can be applied to things like the challenge of climate change. Almost every country in the world now has a goal to get to net zero by 2050, but have they got the pattern of accomplishment? Is it being applied in a systematic way to enable them to accomplish that? Because humanity depends on that, and there's a number of other challenges facing us as well. So that's the kind of big picture. And I'm not wanting to be overgrounded myself, but if there is a pattern to accomplishment, we can start to apply it to some of those very big challenges facing humanity. But the two things that I think are most important, one is the focus point. Even when it gets boring, just stick at it, keep at it, because if you're doing the right things and you keep doing them, they will work in the end, and that does require discipline. And the other is to go back to what I said earlier on, is if you're going to do something ambitious and challenging, you do have to learn as you go. You don't know enough at the beginning to do it. And so how are you making sure that you learn all the way through what's working, what isn't working, how you can get better, how you can improve? Do you need a coach to do that? Do you need somebody to talk to, a thought partner, whatever language you want to use? And where do you get the data from? So that ability to learn as you go, to me, is fundamentally important.
And do you think a thought partner or a coach, or what, like you say, however you want to describe it, is vital in that? Because I think you say in the book, don't you? There's only so much you can achieve on your own.
Yes, I think you need, for almost anything, you need a small team. It might only be 5 or 6 people, but you do need people around you who understand what you're trying to do and believe in you. And if you need it, we'll help you. One of the people I talk about in the book has her learning set. She's trying to learn to sing, having had really damaging cancer, and she really benefits from the trusted people in her learning set. In government, you need people who will tell you what they really think, because everybody is trying to get credit in government. Everybody's trying to get promoted. Politics is like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you do need people who will tell you really how it is, and that was often my job for Blair. So the delivery unit looked like a success in retrospect, but in years 1 and 2, lots of things weren't working, and we weren't making progress. And I was having to go and see Blair and say, we're not making progress on this, or that's difficult. And I always remembered what Margaret Thatcher said about David Young back in the Thatcher years. She said, the others bring me problems, he brings me solutions. And so if I went to Blair with a problem, I always said, so we've got this problem, I want you to know that, but this is what we're doing, or these are the options. This is how we think we will deal with it. So you're always going with a creative solution. But that's how learning works in government. You need trusted people who tell you exactly what they think, regardless of the swirl of politics around you.
Okay, That begs the question then, for someone who's perhaps on their own, like a sole trader or starting a business on their own, how should they cope with that if there isn't someone immediately obvious? Perhaps there's a wife or a relationship. Perhaps would you suggest lean on that, or seek a thinking partner in another way? But for someone on their own,
there might be a partner, there might be good friends, there might be grown-up children, there might be any number of people you could talk to, or there might be a network of people doing similar things, but they're not direct competitors. There might be a small business community in your town. You might be able to go to the Chamber of Commerce and meet people, like-minded people who are doing similar things. But I'm not saying you couldn't do it on your own. And I think James Dyson was actually very much a classic of doing it on his own before he got going. But I'm saying many of us would find that very, very difficult. The ability to express frustration, to get support, to get people to say, yeah, well, I know that's gone wrong, but don't worry because the idea is really good. That sense of direct feedback and support from somebody you trust, I do think is helpful.
Absolutely. And objectivity as well.
Objectivity, yes. So they'll look at the facts and they won't say, oh, don't worry about it, Michael. It's not as bad as you thought. It is as bad as you thought, but what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Well, listen, Michael, you've been full of good information. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I've really enjoyed talking. And listen, I'm going to go out on a limb here. You talk about, trying to achieve big things. So I'm going to ask you directly, what chance do you think of me getting Tony Blair on?
I'd say that you have a reasonably good chance of doing that, actually. I would give you at least 50-50. You have to approach him in the right way, choose the right moment, get some... He's obviously a very busy person. But yeah, I think he might like talking about all of this. So I think it would be definitely worth a try.
Okay, and then you've certainly lit the light of hope in my mind there. So in terms of then how a quick bit of advice in terms of that big goal, that big accomplishment, getting former Prime Minister Tony Blair on, what advice would you have?
I think it goes back to exactly what we've been talking about all the way through, Simon. Is why do you want him on your show? Is it just for celebrity status, as you mentioned earlier on? Or is it that there's something that he is uniquely well placed to discuss with you that you think your listeners would really care about and would make the world a more interesting and perhaps a better place? So I think why do you want to talk to him other than the celebrity element is what I would think about, and then approach him on that basis.
Brilliant. Michael, that was fantastic advice. I can see why Tony Blair and so many other prime ministers have valued your input so incredibly highly, and so many governments around the world and elite sporting organisations. So I just want to say congratulations on the book. Congratulations on everything you've done, really. And I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I've really, got a lot of really valuable information from this conversation, but also from the book as well, that I've been able to even start applying in my own life. Often the simple things like the focusing on the key things, but it's been very valuable. And I've just really enjoyed chatting to you for the last hour. So much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. And thank you very much for paying such close attention to Accomplishment, the book. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Lessons podcast. I would be delighted to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your guest suggestions, your questions. Just get in touch via my website, simonmundie.com. And if you could share this episode with someone you know or on social media, I would be very grateful, as it does really help people to find this podcast. That's it for now. I will be back with a bite-sized episode this Friday and another full-length episode next week. Until then, goodbye.
If you want to learn from failure, you need to ask what is to be done before you ask who's to blame. Because once you ask who's to blame, everybody's minding their backs. If I went to Blair with a problem, I always said, so we've got this problem. I want you to know that, but these are the options. This is how we think we will deal with it. So you're always going with a creative solution. The basic idea that when you go in to negotiate something, don't get mad, don't get even, get what you want. And think about, if you humiliate somebody in that process, how that's probably going to make doing whatever it is more difficult.
Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life. How can you achieve truly ambitious and challenging things? What if you could follow a proven pattern to tackle your most challenging plans? Whatever it is you'd like to do, whether it's starting a business, running a marathon, or transforming a school, this episode is for you. My guest is Sir Michael Barber, whose career has straddled the world of elite sport and government. Since joining the government back in 1997, he's advised 7 of the last 8 prime ministers, the exception being Liz Truss. In the world of sports, Michael has advised Team Sky, the elite cycling team, and he's a member of the Football Association's Technical Advisory Board, which helps the FA prepare England's teams, both men and women, for major tournaments. Michael's written a book called Accomplishment, and we discuss some of the key themes in this episode so that you can immediately start applying them in your own life. It was an absolute pleasure talking to Michael, and I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation.
Sir Michael Barber, how lovely to have you on the podcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Simon.
So am I, very much so. Now, Michael, do you mind if I call you Michael?
No, please call me Michael.
Okay, it does make things a little easier. I've already introduced you in the introduction, but I'm just going to recap briefly. Obviously, you've had a very impressive career straddling the worlds of government and elite sport. You joined the UK government in 1997 to become the chief advisor on school standards. Since 97, you've advised 7 of the last 8 prime ministers, the exception being Liz Truss. In 2001, you set up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, the first of its kind anywhere on the planet, now replicated across the globe, which was